All right, welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. The following seminar is brought to you by iExplorer Club. I am honored to be introducing our seminar presenter today, Ryan Kern, who will be telling us all about the sun, bacteria, and other amazing biology topics. So Ryan, the time is yours.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ryan Kern. I'm a 10th grader at Troy High School. And as you probably see from these photos here, I really like to play the piano and I like swimming a lot. I really like being in the water. I also play water polo too, so they kind of go together. And here is actually a stethoscope, which is used by doctors a lot because I really like biology, and when I grow up, I want to become a doctor. So today's topic is going to actually be the sun. And I wanted to go over the sun because it's very important, and it's really important for all life on Earth. And also, I know a lot of people are actually curious about it, like why is the sun so important, right? Like what would happen if we didn't have it? And a lot of other things, such as like how does the sun actually benefit us, and what can we do to protect our skin? Putting on sunscreen. So I thought I wanted to go over a lot of that, and I thought it'd be really interesting for everyone. So here, obviously, we have the solar system, and this is the sun in the very center. But it really gives you perspective, right? Because we look at Earth, it's pretty small compared to the sun. And that's really because the sun is so huge. That's why even though we're super far away from it, we can still have like a super hot day in the desert with a ton of sun, even though we're so far away. And we still have like the atmosphere and everything. So that shows really how strong the sun is. And if you're closer to the sun, like Mercury, is going to be super dry and really, really, really hot. If you think it's hot here in the desert, well, this is like super far away already. And if you go even closer, it's just being really dry. Yeah, and then once again, we see how small and almost like it looks almost like fragile compared our Earth compared to the actual sun. And if you've studied like a lot about the solar system, you actually realize that, like I was saying with the sun, how far away it is from how far away the Earth is from the sun is actually how hot the Earth will get. And because the Earth is a pretty set distance away from the sun, it's really in like a perfect kind of range. If it was too close, the water would mostly just evaporate and there'd be no water. And we know that like all life needs water. The oceans, like that's where a lot of the sea creatures are, and there's so much life in there. And if we didn't have that, then we wouldn't have like really half of all of our species that we have today, right? We have like whales and a whole number of different like species in the oceans. However, if we went too far away, the opposite would happen, and we would just have a huge, almost like ice age, and everything would just freeze over, and really not much would be able to survive because it'd be so cold. Like think for example, like the rainforest, right? There's so much biodiversity. That's just a word that means there's a lot of different animals and plants, right? And there's so much, but they're really good just surviving at the rainforest. So if the rainforest completely freezed, all of them would die because they don't have protection. They don't have like fur really that's supposed to fight against cold. They're just used to that hot climate. So that's really something that we need to keep in mind, is that our Earth is really pretty much perfectly placed. So yeah, that's a pretty interesting fact. And another thing, this is really the emphasis is going to be on sunlight. So we have the sun over here, and then it'll actually send like rays out. And it's not only just towards the Earth, obviously. It goes out like in this direction, also like up and behind, all sorts of ways. But when it hits the Earth, the Earth's tilt is also what gives us like seasons, right? So as you can see here, we have like daytime at this part, and then it'll be nighttime over here. That's why when you look on a map and on the other side of the world is some other like country, when it's daytime where you are, it's going to be probably nighttime or around nighttime there. And it's going to be a big time difference. So that's because of this, because the rays are only going to hit part of the Earth. And so as the Earth tilts, you'll get more sun and then like less sun. And it's really like, it's not just like a perfect circle in the center. It's kind of tilted to the side. So it'll wobble a little bit as it spins. And really just what happens is you get different amount of sunlight, and that's what happens. You get winter, you get spring, summer, and fall. So that's very important, because otherwise it would be very boring if we just had one season. Yeah, the next part that's very important, because we look back, right? We see these like big, huge rays, right? Next, we need to talk about the atmosphere. That's just the little bubble, if you will, around the Earth. and it's really protecting us from a lot, right? Because in these rays, there's actually a lot of like, radiation, a lot of like bad stuff that can damage us. That's why the atmosphere is there to protect us. And as we see here, it's going to stop a good amount of rays, and a good amount of rays, also like the dangerous stuff that they take with it, but some will still be able to pass through, which is good because we don't want to just live on the surface and be all dark and have no sunlight, but we don't want it to be completely exposed and have the sun's direct rays, like, because there's a lot of radiation from that, and we'll get into that later, and that's really has bad effects. Now we're finally at the surface here, and we also see that yes, there is some sunlight that will come through, and it will also reach, which is why we have trees, right? Because we talked about photosynthesis, how important light is for photosynthesis to happen. If there was no light, then there'd be no photosynthesis, and literally all the trees would be gone because they wouldn't have any way to make food. And let's think about this, right? We have a giraffe or a zebra or some other animal, right, eating these plants and then eating, tree leaves or stuff like that, eating grass. Well, if the grass goes away, then those zebras, those giraffes, they're going to go away too because they're not going to have any more food. So what we see is that eventually the lions and cheetahs that will eat those zebras are going to starve too. And then what happens is the entire ecosystem, which is just like all the living things, right? And some of the non-living things like the sunlight. Sunlight is not alive. So like the entire group of animals, they're all just going to end up like dying off, and it's going to be a mass extinction, which is just where a bunch of animals die off and then they never come back. This just shows how important sunlight is, because without plants that rely on sunlight, we won't have any of the other animals. Yeah, and then here we talked about how photosynthesis, right, happens, and it gives the plant the food, and it in return gives us oxygen, and some other animals will eat the plant too and get their nutrients from there. Now here we have a huge sun, right? And what this really equals is the same thing as kind of a torch, if you think about it, right? You go into like a dark, mysterious cave, right? And then you light a torch, and then all of a sudden you can see stuff. And it's really important that you have that torch, because otherwise you might trip over some rocks, you might trip or hit your head, and that'd be very dangerous, right? Just like if we don't have the sun, first of all, we won't be able to see anything because it'll be all black. Second of all, we're gonna also freeze, because that's the source of heat, right? We're talking about how Mercury is just another planet that's very close by. Since it's so close, it's super hot. But if we go farther away, or if there's no sun, then we get super cold and things get to freeze over. And like we were saying, without sunlight, there's no plants. And then without plants, there's no animals really. So that's something very, very important. Like if the sun were just to turn off all of a sudden, it would affect a lot of people and all of the life on Earth. Now, I have a question here. Hopefully it shouldn't be too hard for you. What would happen if we didn't have the sun? I was kind of talking about this a little bit, but hopefully you should be able to get it. I think C is very interesting. The Earth would just explode. Okay, make sure you guys vote. Okay, we'll give everyone just a couple more seconds to vote, so make sure you guys vote. Okay, great. Yeah, so you guys are always correct usually. We would all freeze and not have any food to eat after a while, because really all of our food, you eat a steak. Where that eventually came from, it came from the grass, right? So without these like fundamental like building blocks of all life, without the plants, there'd be nothing else. So, yep. And the Earth is not just going to randomly explode if there's no sun. And we would not be able to keep living, because again, everything relies so much on the sun. Now, this may look very complicated and you may be like, oh my gosh, like what is this? But I'm going to explain it very simply, and then we're going to move on, right? Here, we just have, you can think of like a wave, right? So you think about the radio stations, right? You're like, well, how am I able to listen to the radio stations in the car, right? Because there's just like this wire that's sticking out of my car, and then I just turn the knob and I can listen to radio and music. Why is that? Well, there's actually this little like things called waves here, and as they get like shorter and shorter and shorter, they get like more and more energy. So, and we see here that like the visible, that should means all the colors. So everything on the earth that has color is from this kind of section, if you will, of the light. Then over here is something called gamma, which is just very, very high powered, like really, really high powered. And what they'll do is they can actually like, um, they have like so much energy that they can really change the atoms even of anything really. So that's why they're very, very dangerous. And yeah, and you can see that here the radio waves are really like stretched out. So when like you're listening in your car, you probably are going to be really far away from like the actual radio tower. That's why they're so long, because then they'll just be able to travel really far distance. But we're really going to be focusing more on like this thing called UV, and that's where like most of the skin cancer and a lot of the stuff affecting the skin actually comes from. Yeah, and this is a really important part too, right? Because how do the sun's rays affect DNA? Because we already talked about how important DNA was to all life and how it really coded for everything, all our genes. And so how would it affect it? We talked about how powerful some of these UV rays are that are still able to go past the clouds, and that means they're touching us. So what effects does that have on our DNA? And remember, we have mutations that could happen, and if that happens in the DNA, what is that eventually going to lead to? Yeah, so the options are causing it to uncoil and kill the cell, or changing the nucleotides, causing mutations, or by heating up the cell and then causing it to explode, releasing its DNA. Okay, we'll give everyone a couple more seconds, and we're going to move on. Yeah, so great job. It's going to be changing the base pairs and then causing mutations. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this actually a little bit here. So what happens is, since it's so strong that they will occasionally, it's not like every single cell in your body when it's like touching this UV like light, right? These pretty strong light, like when it touches your skin, it's not like all of a sudden they all just start breaking and then everything like changes and mutations and all of this happens. No, but occasionally there may be something that like hits in, right? And then it goes through, and then it'll actually hit the DNA, and then it'll cause, sometimes is a change in the pair, but actually sometimes it can like cause a little break too. And either way, it'll actually cause problems, because what can happen is, we talked about how DNA coils, right? Well, think about it. If you have a rope, right, and you're trying to coil it up, but then in the middle, all the rope is just torn apart, right? So it's gonna be very hard to coil. And so that's what can actually happen is, with all these like breaks, if they're not fixed, it can make it very hard for the future too, to just try to coil it, try to read it, try to actually use it, right? Like, let's think about it like this. You have this super special document that you need to understand, maybe for your math test or something. And all of a sudden someone spilled like coffee on it, and it became all muddy by the rain, let's say, and then your dog bit off a corner. Well, you trying to read that is going to be very, very hard compared to just having the normal piece of paper and being able to read that. So this is kind of what's happening, is by eventually all these changes, then they cause the mutations, because some of it is actually changed, and then some of it is like the DNA becomes so bad they can't read it. And we'll actually learn later that sometimes if the DNA becomes so unusable, that means that there's so many problems, the cell can't just like fix all of them, that it will actually just cut it out. Now, we talked a little bit why like the sun's so bad, but why is it actually good for us? You may have heard like, oh, the sun is good for you, you need to get your daily sunlight, but why is that? Because we talked about how bad it can be. So why is it actually good for us? Now, the first one is killing bacteria, or is it giving a certain vitamin, or it gives us food, or it gives us a nice tan? So why do you think the sun is good for us? Yeah, I definitely encourage you guys to vote, because I want to see what you guys think too. Okay, make sure you guys vote, and then we're gonna close it here pretty soon. Okay, we can close it, yep. So it does give us a certain vitamin that we need, and that vitamin is vitamin D. Yeah, so there's really an important balance. This is really just like the healthy eating seminar, right? You can't just eat all your vegetables and all your fruits and then or only vegetables and never eat fruits or never have your bread or your protein. You can't just do that. That's not healthy, right? We need to have that balance. So same thing here. You can't not have any sunlight for like a year, and you can't go out every day for 5 hours in the sun without sunscreen. So there's also this balance here too. This one, they're talking about the different types of skin. So that just means different shades. So like super light to pretty dark. And you might notice that like pretty light here, like the really light skin, you need less because there's actually this thing called melanin in your skin. It's just like a color pigment. And then pigment is just like, it's really just color. So it has to do with the color of your skin. And if you know something is that the very, very light skin is very like easy to absorb that sun, and there's not that much protection versus if it's pretty tanned, then it'll have more protection, and then if it's very dark, it'll have a lot of protection, right? So we see here that there's actually based off the seasons too, because in summer there'll be less time because the sun will be stronger. However, in winter it's actually it's more time. That's because the sunlight is like a little weaker. And if we think about this, this makes sense because we're talking about how the earth kind of tilts, right? Well, if there's a lot of sun on one spot, but then you go maybe up here, then the sun is not like directly hitting it. And so it's just kind of going over there. It's not like all the way over here where there's no sun, but it's kind of going there. So that's why you need more time in the winter time than summer. And it's very important to notice like these are always approximate, right? Each person's going to be different. And these can be kind of changed too if you really need to wear sunscreen for all of these, right? So even if you have pretty dark skin, you still need to wear sunscreen because we're talking about how those rays can cause like mutations, right? Just because your skin is dark doesn't mean you just don't have like any mutations. It's not possible, but it's better at absorbing it. And if we think about this, right? Let's say you go to the beach, you're going with your friends, right? And you don't get sunburned, but you get kind of like a pretty like red back. It's almost sunburned, but not quite. So then you're like, okay, well, maybe I should have put on sunscreen, but I didn't. Then the next couple of days, you just don't go to the beach, you don't go out much. And you actually see that if you keep doing that, you keep repeating that cycle, then your skin will actually become darker. And that's really your skin's way of being like, hey, this person just keeps going out in the sun without much sunscreen, so I need to help protect it. However, that doesn't always happen because some people that have very light skin, sometimes they don't tan very well. So that just means that their skin doesn't just darken like it does. And in any case though, it's really important to always wear your sunscreen. Like always wear your sunscreen. You look at these minutes, like that's not really the minutes that you can be out there without sunscreen because again, if the sun is super strong and then it still hits you, it's still going to be very damaging. Yeah, and this was the different kinds of like rays or just different types of light here, right? You don't really need to worry about the A, B, C stuff because you see C here, it's gone in the atmosphere, right? And you just need to focus on UV because that's the ultraviolet. That's the stuff we were talking about. That's the stuff, if you look on the sunscreen, you're like, oh, it says it protects like against UVA or UVB. That's just something to know. Because as you see here, many UVB blockers, so there's two main types, right? The UVA, UVB, and really one of them is like stronger, right? So as you can see, the normal sunscreen that you get will just be okay for UVB, right? But then this UVA sunscreen needs to be blocked by something like physical. So I talked about this a little bit in my seminar on like healthy eating where I went over like sunscreen, right? But if you have something that's like physically blocking it, the sun will not touch your skin. Versus you put on sunscreen, like maybe spray or something like that, there's not really actually anything physically blocking it. because the B rays, the UVB rays, they're a little bit weaker. So what will happen is it takes less to block them. But if you really want to block both, then you need to have something physical, which it doesn't have to be sunscreen. You could put on like long sleeve shirt and pants and then wear shoes and a hat. You could do that, but sometimes it's hard if you want to go to the beach and want to jump in the water, right? So then that's why you wear sunscreen to help protect that. This is a very, very painful image here. As you see, these people did not put on sunscreen. You can see they were like wearing a shirt or something that day, and then they got a really bad tan line here. And then the problem is with, we're gonna look later, is actually having sunburns can increase your risk of having skin cancer, which is a really bad thing. So we don't wanna have that. And yeah, but this just really highlights, because I was talking about how you can physically block it, right? So this guy was wearing his shirt. Well, that physically blocked the sun from kind of going into here. And she was wearing this strap here. That's the same thing, kind of blocked it there. But you notice they didn't put on any really sunscreen on the outside here, and they still got really hit hard by by just not wearing sunscreen in the sun. Yep, so melanoma is like a type of skin cancer. And they were saying every time you have 5 or more sunburns, you're actually going to have like double the risk, right, of having the skin cancer. Now, why is that? Well, we're talking about, hey, these rays are very strong. Well, if they hit my skin and then the sunburn, right, you see the skin kind of peel off. Well, those are the skins that they died. They died to like save your body. Just like in the movie, you know, the hero goes out, he's like, I must like take one for the team. It's just like that. Your cells were doing that because they want to protect you. And then they just like died off because of that. But the problem is that there's going to be some left that may have the really big problems in the DNA. And all it takes is one problem in the DNA that causes the cell to just keep dividing. And really, it's kind of like a checkpoint, right? We were talking about how if you have like a checkpoint, right? When you're dividing, you don't want to keep dividing all the time, right? You want to stop eventually, because like our skin cells are not always dividing. Like when we're sleeping, they're not always dividing, because they need to stop at some point. They can't always just keep going and going. So they have like this kind of limiter thing that's there, and it'll be like, okay, now you're done dividing. Don't divide again. But sometimes you can break that with problems in the DNA, and the cells will just keep dividing. There's a very good example of this woman who is, I believe, in the 1900s or so. She had this type of cancer, and they took some of her cells and they just put it in kind of like the little like petri dish, and they cultured it. Just means like they let it grow, and they gave it like its nutrients and stuff. And even to this day, those cells are still dividing, and they've been actually used and put across the country in the US for like research, just because they're really good cells just as examples, and they're actually even used in high school sometimes. And so it's very, very interesting, because those things have been really dividing for almost like hundreds of years. Yeah, so I thought that was very interesting. Now, this is some of the really like descriptors, or what melanoma, the skin cancer, will look like. And this is really to help you, because sometimes people look at melanoma and they're like, how do I know I have it? Because you might have a freckle up here. Well, does that mean I have melanoma? No, not really. It has to fit these certain like looks, right? It's gonna be like uneven. So the main thing I really took away from here was it's uneven, has different color, and then it's also gonna change over time. So really, if you have a mole that's like doing that, then I would say you may not have it, but you can definitely go to the doctor and get it checked, because it'd be better you just go to the doctor, get it checked, and then they say, oh, no, it's okay. Then you actually have it, because the main thing with cancer is actually detecting it early. So that means being like, oh, wait, I have this cancer. And then that way they can be like, oh, hey, like now we can see what we can do to help prevent it from getting worse. Versus you don't find out until a long time later, then they're like, I can't really do too much at this point because there's not a cure right now. And so that's why it's a lot better if you just kind of look at yourself, be like, do I have any of these? And then if you really feel like one meets this, then you can go see your doctor and just check it out. Here is also a really in-depth look here. This is actually the cells. And we're talking about how the sunburn, like this poor dude over here, it'll start to peel. Well, this is the normal cells, and like apoptosis, you may be like, oh my gosh, that's such a big word. How could you even put this big of a word on the slide? It really just means cell like dying. So let's say the DNA is really bad, right? Well, if it's so bad, and then the cell itself might be like, wait a second, this DNA is really bad. If I actually, make it into a protein, then maybe it'll actually kill me. So then I'm just going to remove myself and then just safely, like release all my stuff into the surrounding cells, and then that'll be fine. So that's really, it's like a program. It's really a self-destruct button, because you have the robot, right? Maybe the robot goes crazy. Well, you always want to have that button so it can just like blow up it, just so that it won't hurt anything else. That's the same thing here. And you see, normally it's okay, right? Just have skin cells like this. But then afterwards, these skin cells are kind of missing here, and they start to peel. And a lot of these kind of cells here too also just like are missing as well. And so they actually like came off. Yeah, so we're already talking about this a lot, but really the sun will actually affect the DNA and have pretty big effect, like we were saying, with the mutations and the cells actually dying. So it has a pretty big effect with that. And we also have the sun here, right? And I noticed that someone picked like, oh, the sun will like kill the bacteria on the skin, right? Well, it may, but that's not really what happens, right? Because on our skin, we have a lot of like bacteria and stuff like that, but a lot of it's actually good bacteria, and we don't want to actually kill it, because what can happen is like, let's say for example, like you have a group of really good friends, right? But then all your good friends leave to go to a different school. Well, if you have a bunch of bad friends, right, that start to become your friends now, well, now you're going to be surrounded by like bad friends, and that's no good. Same thing with bacteria. If the good bacteria is like killed, then bad bacteria can take over, and then that'd be really bad, and then you can have a lot of problems with that. Yeah. And so now we're going to get into really bacteria, because I realized that it's kind of connected with the sun, and also that like it's a really important topic that we haven't really talked too much about yet. And also at the very end, if you guys stay, we'll have a little overview of my own experiment I was doing at my house with bacteria too. So here's just the structure. The structure, this is the same thing with the cells, right? The very specialized cells, they're gonna look different. Not all of the bacteria look like this. Some may not have any of these little arms. Some may look like a really tiny dot. Some may look like a lot bigger. So there's a lot of variation, but this was kind of the overall look. And this is actually a specific type, E. coli. And you may be thinking, wait a second, isn't E. coli like that really bad thing that you hear about in the news, and then like a bunch of people got sick from it? Yeah, but there's actually different types of the same bacteria. I think I mentioned this before, but bacteria actually are dividing pretty fast. So they don't have a lot of the DNA checkers that we do. And that's why we don't have, like when we're born from now, it's pretty unlikely that we just all of a sudden get cancer for no reason. That's because we have pretty low mutation. But these bacteria have a really high mutation. What does that mean? Let's think about an analogy, right? Let's say you're driving and then there's a bunch of cones on the side, so you're supposed to just go straight, right? So if you have maybe your mom in the car with you, and then they're helping you drive, and you drive straight, right? Versus you tie yourself and you like make a blindfold and you just try driving like that. Well, that's not gonna end up too well. Same thing here. If you don't have something checking it, there's gonna be bound to be more mistakes that go through. Then what happens, right? The cell divides, then the next generation, the next two cells have those mistakes. And so that can have a really big impact as well on the future generations, whether it could be good if it changes something that gives a bacteria like a benefit, right? Or it could be bad and then make the cell have to like die. Now, this is a really interesting question, because I said they divide fast, but the question is how fast? How often does E. coli divide and make new bacteria? Do you guys think it's every 20 seconds? every minute, every 20 minutes, or every hour? I'll be very interested to see what you guys think. Okay, we'll give everyone just a couple more seconds. Make sure you guys vote. Okay. Wow, so this time everyone got thrown off. No, it's not every 20 seconds. It's actually every 20 minutes. Every 20 seconds is extremely, extremely fast. Like that's crazy, crazy fast. And there are some, again, this is, E. coli is not all bacteria. That's just one type. So there are some that take longer and there are some that take like less amount of time. But for just the one we're looking at today, it's gonna be around every 20 minutes. Now, if we think about that though, we're like, they divide every 20 minutes. So that means they divide 3 times in an hour, and then they divide like 24 hours. Wow, that's a lot of dividing already. Wait, but why isn't there like bacteria all over the earth, like covering everything? And like, why is it not taking over? Because it's dividing so fast. Well, I'm going to actually explain that right here too. So what happens is bacteria, first of all, if they have a bad mutation, that can cause them to die, right? But if they are also taken out by something else, maybe another type of bacteria, or even just like humans or something, right? Because let's think about it. If we cook some food that originally had bacteria, well, we killed those bacteria. Or we could have like, if we clean the house, if we use like the disinfectant, we're going to kill bacteria. So a lot of those things really just like take bacteria out of the picture. Also with, let's say there's like this bacteria that's maybe riding on some animal's skin in the wild. Well, if that animal is going into like a really hot desert and the animal just ends up dying, the bacteria is probably going to die too because it's just so hot and it's unlivable. Same thing with being at the very, very North Pole, right? The bacteria there have to be very, very strong and very, very like specific. It's not going to be like all bacteria can live there because it's just so cold. So a lot of these things will really cause it to grow because it'll grow really fast for a short amount of time. Like we're saying, they divide every 20 minutes. That's pretty fast. So they'll grow really fast. But then at this point, they're just going to level out because let's say, we're getting the Clorox ready and maybe some like stops it from growing. And then all of a sudden they just all die like that. However, there's going to be some left over for the next time. So this really like this fluctuation, this going up and then going down and then going up and then going down is really why there's not so much bacteria all over the earth, because otherwise there'd be no room left for any animals or humans. Now notice there's one part here, this thing called like theoretical growth is not that big of a deal. It's just saying that, hey, if we were thinking about it without any like humans, nothing, maybe just on a random planet with nothing on it, and we just had bacteria and they had enough food, well, hey, they would just keep growing and they would just keep growing and growing and growing. So that's what would have happened if there wasn't any like humans or any, maybe some weather, like a lightning strike a tree and then killed bacteria, or really just maybe even another thing too, right? Because if we think about it, well, everything needs food, right? So if the bacteria run out of food, then they don't have anything to support themselves, and then they have to end up all dying almost, except for maybe the one or two or a couple that survive. Yeah, we're going to use an island analogy here. So we first have, let's say, like a box of food that comes to the island. Then we're like, hey, let's go to the island, right? It has a box of food, and then there's like palm trees and everything. Well, what happens when that food runs out? Well, we're like, well, there's nothing else to eat here, right? Like, what am I going to eat for dinner? I am really hungry. So then these two people would end up dying. So this is the same thing really with bacteria, because if we give them, you'll see we have these little plates that have like, called medium, but it's just it's bacteria food. You can think of it like that. And so we grow it on them. We grow the bacteria using those plates, but eventually that food is going to run out. If the bacteria keep dividing, they keep like eating up that food and using it. but eventually it's going to run out, and then there's going to be nothing left for the bacteria. So then the bacteria have nothing, they can't eat anything, they can't survive. Yeah, this is one example of that plate I was talking about. So these little dots here, these are actually bacteria, and then they have been growing. And you see this tan, this really tan part here, that is the plate part. And it's actually really cool because it looks like a gel, and it's like a, almost like Jello, but don't eat it. But yeah, it looks kind of like Jello. So, and really what's been happened is originally they kind of like heated it up. So if you think about how you make Jello, I think you have to like heat it up first and then you let it cool, right? And you kind of make like a mixture first. So you mix the powder in with like some water, some like food coloring or something, and then you heat it up to make sure it's all mixed together, right, properly, and then you cool it to make it form that Jello. Well, same thing here. If you actually want to make it at your home, you have to put in like the special solution, add some like powder, then heat it up. So it's in this very like warm liquid, then you pour it, let it cool, and then you form the gel. And yes, this was the question I was waiting for, but hopefully we're going to still ask it. Hopefully everyone gets it right if you guys are paying attention here. So why are bacteria not covering the earth if they're reproducing so fast? So we're not going to spend too much time on this one because everyone should hopefully get it. Yeah, we're going to get into some very interesting stuff today, so I'm very excited. Okay, yeah, we can close the voting now. Great job, everyone. I'm glad you guys paid attention. Yeah, so they are not surviving for that long. We already talked about this, how there's so many different things that can affect them, and that's just leading to them not really surviving for so long. However, did you know something? I thought it was very interesting. There's actually, we're talking about good bacteria before, but there's actually good bacteria in your stomach. And what this actually does is that helps kind of break down the food. So I thought that was a cool fact if you didn't know. And yeah, they digest food. And we were talking about how stomach acid, right? It's very, very strong and it can like dissolve. It can make things like break up and stuff like that. Well, that's really just like the thing in the North Pole. Because if it's in the North Pole, it has to be able, the bacteria has to be able to survive that really, really cold temperature. Well, if it's in your stomach, it has to be able to survive that really, really like acidic, it's like an acid almost. And it would like dissolve it just like in the movies, but it has something that very like really strongly just protect it and then allow it to survive there. We'll also see this in some, if you actually go to a natural hot spring, there's like the really hot ones, there's actually some bacteria that live there. Even though it's like over 100 degrees, it's like really crazy. It can get really hot there. So that's one example of how the bacteria are able to like adapt to the environment better and then they can survive it. Because if you think about it, not all bacteria can live there. Well, now those bacteria have an advantage. They can be like, hey, I can eat this food because I'm the only one here. And they can reproduce there and then they can really just have the upper hand. Yep. And really good, interesting thing is having this good bacteria that can actually come from like eating yogurt. This will actually help you digest food, right? And it can actually help if you have, let's say, a lot of like stomach problems. It can help like kind of clean it out. And the bad bacteria, on the other hand, can cause a lot of really like a lot of just like inflaming. So that just means like it gets swelled up and then it hurts sometimes. So that's why we keep seeing this again and again, and it's not going to go away, right? We have diet, what we eat is really affecting our entire body. Yeah, so this is really the comparison here. It's shown that actually what you eat can change the type of bacteria in your stomach. So if you eat good, healthy food, you make sure you eat yogurt as well, you will have better like bacteria in your stomach than if you eat a lot of unhealthy junk food. Because what will happen is the good bacteria can only use this like as nutrients, right? But the bad bacteria can only use this as nutrients. So when you eat all this, your good bacteria is probably not gonna be able to survive, or it's gonna go down a lot. And we're saying how, hey, if that good bacteria gets killed, then the bad bacteria is gonna move in, and vice versa. If the bad bacteria gets killed, well, then the good bacteria can move in. So really just remember, if you're eating like this right now, you can always change, and then the bacteria will change as well. And yep, this is the sugar. So, or sorry, not sugar. This is yogurt here. And the yogurt is very good because the yogurt actually has a little bit of bacteria too. So that kind of, if you will, like jumpstart, like if you have a car, right, and you don't have electricity, and you go to someone else's car, you plug it in, and then like you can start the car up. Well, just like that can like kind of start your stomach up too. And we were talking about this too, bacteria have mutations way more than humans, like way more. It's very, very significant. And that's why the bacteria can really, one bacteria, like one cell, I would say the lifespan is not going to be very long. Versus you look at a human, all the cells, we're surviving for like a super long amount of time compared to a lot of bacteria. And that's really that's why they replicate so fast. Because if they didn't reproduce so fast, then they'd be gone because they're just not that strong and sometimes, and then they can't survive for very long. And you might be like, okay, well, how do bacteria divide, right? We're looking at cells divide. Well, how do bacteria do it? It's very, very simple. They just have the DNA copy itself, like merge apart, and then they just like have this kind of ring thing that closes it and then kind of snips them like with scissors almost apart. And then that's how they just form it. So it's not really complicated at all. Now, this is a very, very interesting thing. I'm not sure many of you would actually know this answer, but it'd be very interesting to see who does. Did you know that there are actually special viruses that will attack bacteria? So we know currently like there's COVID-19 that's like the virus that's attacking humans, right? But there's actually special viruses that will purposely attack bacteria. Now, what do you think they're called? Are they bacterioviruses, bacteriophages, virobacteria, or banana viruses? I think we'll give everyone just a couple more seconds here. And yeah, we can close it. Cool, cool, cool. You guys actually got it right. I was really proud of you guys. Wow. Yeah, it is bacteriophages. And so what they actually call them is they don't call them bacteriophages because that's a super, super long word, just like how DNA, right? It's this really, really long word, but we just shorten it to DNA. So they're just called phages. And this is what they look like. You know, really, they remind me of like little aliens almost. But you can see they have DNA here. All of this is made out of protein. And then what they do is they kind of attach and then they inject in the DNA. The DNA will go into the bacteria. Since there's no real like nucleus that's holding all the DNA, they can't like stop stuff from coming in. So it can just like touch the DNA, and then sometimes the cell will think, oh, that's my DNA, and then it'll just make it. And then once they do that, they'll actually be making more viruses. Yeah, here is really what happens, like, if you will, like in color almost. So we have this like big bacteria, and you can have tons of these little like phages come on, and then they attach like spiders, and they inject their own DNA. Now, why do these phages matter? Like, why should I care, right? Well, there's this famous experiment that actually used phages, and it determined a huge part of biology. Here we have this experiment, right? This was actually to prove, hey, does DNA hold like genetic material? That just means, does DNA pass on our genetic information, right? If I have really like short hair, or not short hair, if I have very straight hair and not curvy, or if I have like the attached or the free earlobes, right? How does that get passed on to my children, right? Or if I have like brown eyes, how does that get passed on? We talked a lot about this in the DNA seminar. And so really, how did they discover that it was DNA? Well, this is how they did it. They actually used these phages, and then they made some of them radioactive, but they made the protein radioactive for this one. So that means like the actual phage. So the little spider looking thing, if we go back here, this thing would be like radioactive. And you can think of radioactive like in your textbook, you just highlight something. It's like the same thing. So they made this radioactive in one of them. And then in the next one, they actually made the DNA radioactive. Now you might be like, okay, well, what's the point of that, right? Because It's going to inject the DNA. So what? Well, what they did is, I don't know how scientific this is, but they just put it in a blender. So it would everything be chopped up really. And they put it in a thing called a centrifuge. If you don't know what a centrifuge is, if you know those little like merry-go-rounds or the little wheels that spin around, you can like stand on maybe in preschool, it's kind of like that, except it just goes like super fast. So it spins really, really fast. And what'll happen is it'll actually separate the liquid. So let's say you have like this right here, you have something that's very light. The light stuff's going to go actually out on top, and on the bottom will be the very like dense part. Now they were wondering like, well, they know that this protein here is going to be actually light. So it ended up in this part, which is why it's red. But the DNA and the cell is actually going to end up here at the bottom. So what happened was the DNA kind of stayed, and then they realized that, wow, so it's the DNA that's staying inside, and that's really what's happening here. And then they were like, DNA is the genetic material. It's not proteins. Because people back then were seeing how useful proteins were, because we talked about how they're like machines, they're like robots. So like, wow, these things are so useful. They must be used also for DNA, not for DNA, for passing on genetic information, right? But it turns out they actually weren't. And this was the major experiment that really proved that. Now, what was the name of this experiment? Because, you know, we always like to name our experiments here, sometimes like after really famous people, right? Like if you do your own experiment, you probably like to name it after yourself. And so what do you guys think is the name? Is it phage experiment, Hershey and Chase? Is it bacteria experiment? Or is it the DNA versus protein experiment? Okay, we'll give everyone a couple more seconds because I want to make sure I get through everything and also have enough time for questions too. Wow, so it was split even. Phage experiment and Hershey and Chase. Well, the correct answer was actually Hershey and Chase. Those were the two like lab partners that really worked together on this experiment. And you know, a lot of times it's important to realize that in science, like it's not like you discover something and then everyone's like, oh, you're right. Because a lot of the time, Hershey and Chase, everyone thought they were wrong because everyone thought that proteins had the genetic information. But then they were like, no, we think it's DNA. And they went to prove that, and everyone was like, wow, wait a second, that completely changed the way everyone thought. So that's just a reminder that, hey, if you have a unique idea that no one else like really thinks is right or it's true or like it's actually like gonna happen, well, hey, you can actually make it too, just like Hershey and Chase. Yeah, this experiment was so important to its time because it showed that DNA was the genetic material, right? Not protein. This would help us because when we're studying a cell, at that time they were like, let me study the proteins. Do the proteins get passed on? But now they can focus, they're like, hey, oh, I can see the DNA. Okay, let's like focus more on the DNA. And that really helped them. Now we have one more experiment too. That was very important. But wait a second. Why do experiments even matter? Well, let's think about it, right? Because how do we discover new things? It's through experiments. How did we discover, you know, like DNA? How did we discover like the structure? Well, we did that kind of like X-ray thing, right? Of the structure. We saw the like X, and then we saw that, right? And then that's how we discovered, hey, we think it's like a helix, right? We think it's like the double stranded, right? Helix. That's how we figured it out. And that's really important. Even today, scientists are still making discoveries, and they're using experiments to learn more about maybe a new type of like cell or something, or new bacteria. And they're really doing that to further everyone else's knowledge. Because even though it may seem like it, we haven't known this stuff forever. Some of it was relatively new, some of it we knew for a while. But at one point, we had to have someone do an experiment, realize, hey, this is actually something new, and then use that knowledge later on for other people. Yep, this is just what I was saying too. Now our next experiment here is just using kind of like this, I think you can see the bottom too, using mice here. And then we kind of have these like really, some of them are like virus-like, and then bacteria. So some bacteria can cause like the mouse to die, as you can see here. And it was almost like a puzzle sort of, because you're like, wait, so this one has the virus. Okay, so you put in the mouse. Okay, obviously it dies. That's good. This one doesn't. So that's good. It doesn't die. This one, we like basically toasted the virus in like a toaster oven or something, or we boiled it so that it doesn't have the virus, and then it's very like smooth, right? And we inject it, well, nothing happens. That's good. But then wait a second. So if we mix this with the virus, or the non-virus, why does this one die? Well, the non-virus actually has the cells, right? It has the bacteria. The heat boiled one, right? Sort of, that one's still going to have some of the DNA that made this virus one. So this was like, wow, this was huge. They were like, hey, that means DNA can move from like one cell to or one bacteria to a different bacteria, one cell to a different cell, and it can actually combine again together and then form the virus which caused this mouse to die. So if you don't understand it too much, don't worry about it right now. But it was just a really big breakthrough. This is a really good analogy here, right? It's like if you had like a wood block, just a normal wood block, and you had a bunch of like nickels that had like the kind of metal, and you just threw them at each other, and all of a sudden you produce a sword. Because the scientists were so baffled. They were like, how did this even happen? And this really helped them be like, hey, maybe I need to do more experiments. I need to figure out why this happened. And so that's really what pushed them to continue researching. Now we're going to talk a little bit about viruses here. Here, there's a lot of different structures of viruses, right? You see, these are all viruses, but then they all look completely different. That's really because of the different cells. Because viruses, they really target certain cells and they try to get inside, and then they try to use the cell to make more of their own, right? Let's say there's this bakery, this really big like toy making plant, right? And usually they make, let's say, Legos, right? But then someone takes over the plant and then all of a sudden they start making toy cars. Well, that's the same thing that sort of happened here. Once these viruses enter a cell, they hijack or just like take over the cell, and they start using their own like DNA, or it's not always DNA, but it could be like RNA or just any really type of that. And they start making more viruses using the cell. So that's kind of what happens there. This is actually the coronavirus, so COVID-19 here. And you can see, why does it have like all these things on the outside? Well, if we think about a cell, some cells will have these like proteins or little like tags on the outside. This is like a glycoprotein. This is a protein, right? And another type of protein. Well, it's almost like a key. If you have a key that doesn't fit into a lock, it's never going to unlock it. But if you have a key that fits perfectly, it will unlock it. So what happened was, you have all these cells that have like on the outside, they have a special kind of like these proteins. And that's used to show the body, hey, this like weird thing does not have the same proteins as us. And that will let your immune system know, hey, I need to destroy it. But if they didn't have those proteins, then they'd be like, well, something came in. They just don't know that it shouldn't be there. So this is very important. And then the viruses realize that. So they really try to manipulate that. They're like, hey, if I can try to make the same proteins, then the immune system won't be able to like see me, and then I can just go wreak havoc everywhere, cause all sorts of problems. So that's why it has these little proteins on the outside. Now we're gonna end here pretty soon with our microscope. So this was a like experiment I was doing with bacteria. And so I actually was using the plates and then I grew them. And you may be wondering, why did I choose a picture of a dog if I'm going to talk about bacteria? Well, I actually swabbed a little bit of my dog's mouth, as well as my, this is the dog's mouth here. And I grew it inside of a plate that had like that food that we were talking about. It's like a circular plate about this big. And so I actually grew it and I put it underneath the microscope. So here's what we see. This is just the bacteria you can see here, right? Here's like zoomed in a little bit more. still it looks very small, right? Because I looked at before like a lot of different like plants, and then those cells are pretty big. So compared to them, most bacteria are very small compared to most like cells. And here it's even smaller. Now you may be like, okay, well, what even is that, right? Well, if you actually look, they're very, very like small circles. So those will actually be the bacteria. And now I have this pretty cool video here of the bacteria actually moving. It's going to be a little bit shaky, I believe, but actually I think, oh yeah, it's actually at the end here. So if we go here, there should be the video. So if you look very closely, you can see that the bacteria all like kind of moving up into that top right corner there. Yeah. So they're actually moving, and that shows that, hey, these are not just a bunch of dead bacteria. They're still using their little like, arms and stuff. They're actually moving. And so that shows that they're actually alive, and then they'll probably be like dividing, and then they're using that like food and everything too. And so I was trying to record it with my phone, so it was kind of hard to record it. But yeah, you get the general idea there. So these were the plates that I was using here. You can see this gel right here, right? And I actually use cotton swabs. So if you have these gels or stuff at home, you can do it too. Just be careful though that like the bacteria, you want to make sure you tape the lid shut and don't like open it really. Just like you can look at it, but don't open it, because the bacteria, again, if it escapes and then you accidentally grow like some bad bacteria, we don't want that to actually hurt you or anything like that. So again, if you really want to, you can also search up like how to do it. And yeah. So here's the cotton swabs, and let's go back actually too, because this was with a dog one, but I actually did a phone. So I actually took a cotton swab and swabbed the surface of a phone, and here's what I got. So as you can see, there's also some bacteria here, and you zoom in. This one's a little easier to see. Yeah, now you can finally see it. They all look relatively the same, but again, it's just because the bacteria are very, very small. So it's like you have, let's say, a golf ball, a tennis ball, and like maybe a volleyball, and then you zoom out like a mile into the air. Well, you can't tell whether or not those things are different. But if you actually use a different method where you like kill the bacteria and then you put it under this really, really strong microscope, then you actually can see more detail about it. So yeah, and that was it for now. So I think we can definitely go and answer some questions if anyone has any. Thank you guys for joining us.